Dhirubhai,
No.
I think that again we are in this gorgeous place, shrines over here, the river here, down there some kilometers away. We have Gandhi's ashram when he came from South Africa and from Europe. You know, we are in places with a very deep cultural meaning. And today we live in a world in which these cultural and religious and so on meanings are um, in a kind of a turmoil because of the relationships between religions and secularity or secularism, and of course between castes and the equality of citizens before the law. So, and we are here in Gujarat where we had very violent riots and even massacres in 2002 uh, between two religious groups that have been living together for a long time. Of course, we had the partition, which is a very traumatic event in the history of the subcontinent. But why are these religious fights emerging? Is someone fueling them? Are they being utilized for political processes and the political purposes? Sometimes we see the rise of political Hinduism as a more aggressive form of redefining the nation as an Hindu nation and not a pluricultural nation. So are we worried about that? Is something, let's address first the question of religion and then the question of caste, which again is also something that is troubling people everywhere, and at least they are curious to know this. Let's start with religion. We are at the right place to discuss these issues. What do you think, Dhirubhai?
Well, it's a very large issue, but let me say, I mean, lots of problems, it seems to me, is due to very fundamental change and transformation of groups which could be broadly described as religious, or you may say religious communities. Before, what we identified something as a united phenomenon in last couple of centuries as Hinduism, it was more a landscape in which you had a number of religious communities which could be broadly called Hindu, but they were self-contained in themselves in terms of, you may call them sects, small communities, because the Indian landscape by and large is a landscape of communities, small, large, and these communities are primarily formed around caste and religion, irrespective of whether it is communities under Islam. Under Islam also, a couple of 100 years ago, or even 100 years ago, and even today to some extent, there are several communities. And these are primary small communities feeling secure and is also woven into the larger economy. So basically, it's a society of communities. And when Islam came as a one narrative will be of a totalism, that the Islam came, it was all the same, and people embracing and Muslims also becoming one. It has never been the case. Both for what we call Hindus today and Muslims, they were all distributed, if you like. They were all living at one level a common life of in terms of economic and broad cultural terms, and the day-to-day life, which was by and large confined to a smaller caste, religion-based community. So community living is the primary form of living here. What has changed with modernity and with other changes is that these primary communities got totalized under larger religion, in the sense where, because Islam, which is by definition is a totalizing belief, also did not work here like that. I mean, there have been in censuses and everywhere enumeration of so many communities within Islam, distributed some around a pir, some around a small sect, some large sect, and within them there were also castes within Islam.
So Islam
Which,
became Indianized when
Indian in a big way, sort of, and the primary community orientation remained. What happened with modernity and coloniality was to totalize this one way or the other. And so in Hinduism even today, see, people seek to find a deity, a guru, and a community, which is 90-95% of Hindu living day to day is confined to that. Autonomous, but not monadic communities linked to each other through a certain kind of commonality of living and belief. So this was the kind of a scene which modernism transformed into a Hindu-Muslim divide kind of a thing, where division became more important. That doesn't mean that there was no difference, no conflict between some Hindus here, some Muslims there, but there was a bantering relationship, trying to do all this. And there were movements, fundamentalist movements within Islam, as well as some kind of totalizing movements in Hinduism, but they never worked. So this changes, I mean, this scene gets changed into monoliths of communities. So the differences began to be drawn between two big totalities, as it were. And symbolism also emerged in that way. And then you know the history. Then it went as far as to create a separate state of Pakistan out of these things. So this is a larger picture between Hindus and Muslims. But Hindu totalization and homogenization took place more after independence than before. And that has to do with secularism as a contending issue. So there has been a movement by the political Hindu movement, which was more Semitizing the Hindu religion, as it were, trying to work as if it's a one congregation, as one source of norm could be disseminated and all that. And that has not worked even today to a success. But that is the Hindu nation idea in politics. And so far as Muslims were concerned during this, there also was these fundamentalist movements. And they also, I think, after independence, under democracy, have become more sort of unifying for each other, more totalizing.
But you're reading in a sense, you are trying to say, and I would probably dispute that, the idea that here in Gujarat you have a totalizing Hinduism, for sure, fundamentalist, whatever, and that on the other side there is also a fundamentalist Islam. But I don't think that was the case in Gujarat. I mean, the Islam in Gujarat is not known as a kind of Taliban or something.
Not at all. On the contrary. On the contrary.
So someone is trying to exploit these divisions for political purposes.
No, there is no doubt about that. What I'm trying to say that here in Gujarat, it was a party. not one man, the BJP and the RSS and the Hindutva movements, they were constantly, I mean, their consolidation was very important to defeat Congress. And before that, see, the whole attempt is to consolidate religion, different sectarian small community in the total Hindutva fold, so that it asserts itself as a social cultural majority. And that consolidated cultural majority is politically is sought to be converted into political majority. So the aim is more here is of Hindu consolidation. So to convert what was cultural and social into a permanent political majority, durable political majority. And they succeeded in that after that, in the sense that for 10 years, the undercurrent of development also in Gujarat is basically consensus on Hindutva.
Oh, really?
Yeah, culturally. But now it need not be seen as a card for election to election. It's an achieved durable state of consensus.
But if that's so, that's the idea of the end of secularism here.
I won't put it like that, because there is another dimension which is secular to this consolidation, and that is development. See, development requires a cultural consolidation. I mean, which is also a theory of nation,
Right.
in the sense that you have cultural basis for political nationalism. That has happened everywhere in the world, unfortunately. That political nationalism first consolidated and created a kind of religious cultural unity. And in theory also, Gallner and whoever, that nation has a cultural basis. This is not Indian nation how it is made. But in microcosm of Gujarat, I think that is what has happened. Firstly, because the major minority, which is Muslim, is less than 10%.
Less than 10%.
Secondly, it's not a powerful minority, either economically or politically. Was not. So it was easy to create that so-called cultural basis for Hindutva nationalism in Gujarat. So Gujarat, more or less on that basis, found a Hindu nation in a microcosm.
Yes, sir.
And this is not a Hindu consolidation which is blindly against Muslims in that sense. It's not, they do not stay in a state of thrall that we are the two enemies and meet every time. It was, the whole idea was to establish dominance. Hegemony.
And the target was
hegemony. And this is how it happened.
So the target in the end was the Congress party, in a sense.
Yeah, the Congress party was the target, and because Congress also first it was a Janata party, which Congress made a certain social political consolidation of Dalits, OBC, lower caste, Muslims, and those, and that political social consolidation defeated Janata. In fact, not defeated. Actually, Congress absorbed that whole Janata formation through this, which is in Gujarati and political literature is called Kham. Kham means Kshatriya. Kshatriya in Gujarat means lower caste formations of other backward castes. H is for Dalit, Harijan. M is for Muslim, and A, tribal, Adivasis. This is the combination that was created, and this is pure electoral political by Congress to defeat both BJP, which was very small anyway, and the Janata Party. And it ruled as long as this Hindu political formation is ruling today, the Congress thing. And that was defeated by this religious. This is all cynical electoral politics, if you like, at that level. And this was the time it can be proved riots were planned, one way or the other. These were not the first riots.
Yeah.
There were, in '69, there were big riots,
That's right.
which subdued Muslims, and Congress got their sort of surveillance support.
And the 1984 riots were
69.
different? The
Yeah, they were
1984
different. That was in Delhi. Different. Yeah, it was not so much electoral politics as the politics of revenge and all that. That's Delhi. That's Sikh, anti-Sikh riot. But this Gujarat process is more generic. It can happen in other states.
Yeah.
In that sort of thing. So here what you have is use, the politicization of religious communities,
That's right.
if you like.
And you know, by what?
Which is worse than politicization from caste.
Yeah.
Caste does not lead to aggregation into Hindutva. We'll talk about it.
Yeah.
But this is different.
This is different.
So you had Hindu political consolidation. And then one riot was enough, I suppose, for them. But it was cynically perpetrated. Of course, there were events. A train was burnt, where Hindu religious were a victim. See, this is how things happen. When it happened, you can easily apportion blames because there immediacy is there. Somebody
Right.
did this, somebody responded like this. But behind that, there always is a larger picture. And that larger picture has been consolidating Hindu vote in favor of BJP and keep that as a basis for a permanent, or if not permanent, durable political majority. The social religious majority was converted into political majority through this series of things. And riots were only one part of it, but there were many such other things that were done and are still being done, where state more or less sponsors or facilitate Hindu religious activities as if they are public sphere activities.
Yeah,
And
you know,
therefore it becomes a kind
Yeah.
of thing. So now it has sort of rearranged places. So Muslims have been made to understand that these are your boundaries and these are your possibilities, this can do. Because Hindu community, I think it's not like what you may call permanent, continuous animosity to destroy. That's how I see it. It is a kind of cynical use of religion, for religion, and once that hegemony is established, and if they are prepared to live peacefully under that broad hegemonic context, with quote unquote even freedoms and
you say-
security and liberty once this. So that's why it is called a lesson that was taught, quote unquote. And that was also a cynical means to unite Hindus politically. That's why the Gujarat situation is seen as a laboratory for Hindutva.
And you see, as I see this, trying to analyze sociologically what's happening, why the crisis of the secular state, which is usually called, it is interesting that probably there is some connection, and I've been making that connection, that the crisis of secularism is also the crisis of the state that was behind
Yeah.
the national project. And you mentioned Egypt. It's very interesting that both Nasser and Nehru were the founders of the non-aligned movement.
Yeah.
And they met in 1955 in Bandung and created the movement. They had the first conference in 1961. Yugoslavia and other countries joined in later on, Cuba and so on. These people had in mind a third way, neither Soviet Union nor capitalism, but something new, which was a national popular project. It may have been, of course, unjust for some castes or for some religions, but that's the idea of the national project. And in fact, probably in India, it's not so visible as it is in the Middle East, and probably not just for internal reasons, but because of the interests of imperialism, particularly American imperialism, and before that, the British imperialism and all the people that have, and French imperialism, that have been involved in that area because of the natural resources, because of oil and so on, they really brought down those national projects. The state ceased to deliver the goods, so to say,
Yeah,
that they usually do.
I think that is very interesting what you are saying, and that how crisis of the state kind of works into crisis between communities. It's not, but that crisis of state ultimately is about stability, which then ensured by majority. So producing majority. Ideally in democracy, majority is majority of opinion, majority of a perspective, majority of which is a better way of this or that. And therefore the majority is constituted by individual citizens who can be persuaded for the other argument. I mean, that is the kind of a, we accept that is, and we believe that that is the majority we are talking about. But in reality, majority are manufactured and created in a different way, which is not about opinions so simply as it may appear, but which is more about a structural consolidation for hegemony of people, which is more longer lasting, and so that within democratic framework you try to seek hegemony, social cultural hegemony. So,
this hegemony is based also on the delivery of services that the state promised at least to the people, and in fact in many countries did, and Europe was probably the best example of this, with social democracy, with high levels of social redistribution, which now are being is under crisis. And whenever you see the crisis of this form of state, you see in some countries is the rise of the political religion. In Europe is the rise of the extreme right, for instance, hatred of racism, and so on.
No,
and
look at France.
In France,
the Le Pen kind of
the National Front, of course.
And in France, that is also
everywhere. It's not just France. Holland, Denmark, and now in the UK, you have all these
so
rises.
This consolidation takes place on pre-existing lines. Here, the pre-existing lines are around religion.
That's right.
Somewhere else it could be around race. And the same communalism in Indian sense emerges there. Somewhere else it is about outsider-insider demarcation of a different kind. I think the problem is, again, I mean, it's that modernity determined democracy, that the fault lines are, there are fault lines, but the question is, when these fault lines erupt, in what conditions, and in what conditions they remain dormant. For example, Turkey. Turkey is so far managing very well the democratic process, much better than it happened in Egypt. But basically it is a turning over of the secular, military-oriented
Authoritarian.
Pasha inheritance of a strong secular minority and the people. Now the people have come into their own with their religion and expectations and other kind of things. And still the leadership have not allowed to take that open, bloody, communal
That's right. Parents.
position. So lots to do with leaderships, with the managing the crisis of the state and conducting politics, staying on the line as a democratic, as different from the other trappings that democracy requires. So the
Sometimes-
trappings have overloaded democracy.
That's well.
There
That
is
I
trapping
don't.
economy.
By that I dispute that because overload of democracy was a key concept by the Trilateral Commission, which is a
No,
kind of a
I
think
don't
tank.
say that.
In 1975, when
Yeah.
they saw that the democracy was overloaded with rights, more people claiming rights, so we have to, push back all these impulses. Yeah, well, sometimes even people today talk about the idea of racism without race. That is to say, racism is usually if we take it away from the phenotypical difference or whatever racial, incorrect this term as it may be, but these phenotypical differences, color of skin and so on, they may exist as prejudices that are socially constructed, and sometimes people are not so much, even the concept of race, of course, has been discredited completely. People are very much equal in terms of DNA structures and so on. So there is something wrong here, there is disappearance and so on. But we know these things get combined. Being different helps to be excluded as a minority. We see that in Europe today, or the rise of xenophobia, for instance, against immigrants.
Yeah.
And of course you can see there is an interest, as you say, an economic interest, this economic crisis. They are taking away from us our jobs and so on. At the same time, because they are from Algeria, North Africa, most of them, or because they are Muslims, they are easy targets for discrimination.
Yeah.
So in a sense, the forms of discrimination combine to strengthen the sense of exclusion and discrimination against these people. And this, I don't know if this is related to the crisis of the state that hold this idea of a nation, diversified as it is. There is the cultural nation, maybe Hindu, is also Muslim, but there is a kind of a civic nation. We are all from India,
Yeah.
and we are Indians. Some are Hindus, some are Muslims, and you see that in everywhere. This idea that the nation building
Yeah,
on that basis.
that-
But it's in crisis, this nation building. This type of nation building is crisis, and my idea is because it's related to the crisis of the state. And that's why many people become more communitarian, even in India, while I think that we have to look very carefully about the state and care about the state. I don't think that that has been, once I said that the state is the newest social movement. That is to say, the left and the progressive people should not leave the state to the right, as we have now. For instance, in Europe, the state is always identified with whatever is bad for society. The state is predator, the state is not efficient, the market is efficient, the economic, so that's why they are privatizing education. I see this dangerous, and I don't know, but in the crisis of Congress, of the party, that was very much identified with some welfare, social policies for the nation, is also in crisis now.
It is in crisis.
And neoliberalism, I think, will prefer a rightist party coming to power because they don't like social policies anyway.
No, for neoliberalism, they have no problem with Congress.
No?
In fact, they will prefer it, say the first phase of Congress, for example,
Right.
when it was really market-oriented policy, 2004 to 2009. It is in the second phase that they made their policy more populist, and the balance was lost, economic balance. And that's what has created problems with neoliberals vis-a-vis Congress.
Right.
So Manmohan Singh is a better ruler for neoliberals than even if Modi comes to that, because it's an unknown quantity how it is,
Yeah, that's
or
right.
somebody else. So that's, but still there is a crisis of the state, and that crisis is basically about how representation is held and dispensed in policies. Mandates are delivered. That is one crisis of the state as I see it, Indian state. And the other crisis of the state is rule of law. Not just social justice, but to be seen as dispensing normal justice to people without their, whether one is rich or poor, or one is that there is one law for all.
Right.
That conviction, simple conviction, if it travels down to people, I think half the crisis of the state, at least here, not be there. The question is why it is not there, and what interest that state serves. So how the state relates to the interests in the society. It does not mean that it will cease to be a capitalist state or capitalist state. While even you sort of promote market, economic integration, capital, still at the level of dispensing normal rule of law and justice, there is high degree of discrimination.
In concrete terms.
In concrete terms. Who can get away with murder and who cannot get away by stealing a piece of bread? I mean, to put it more dramatically.
Bluntly.
Huh?
Yeah.
So there are people who can get away with murder and loot, and people know who are these people in one way or the other. There are people who cannot get away with a small theft of a piece of bread so easily as this. So this is, I'm trying to dramatize the situation
that's
for
true.
explanation.
Yeah. Yeah, people sometimes tell me that there are some very wealthy people, and I don't even name him, but one of them that has in his pockets the two major parties, and he can nominate ministers. Someone was telling me this the other day. But you are, and the reason why I like so much talking to you is that you are really a social scientist of complexity. Again, simple explanations, and we have still lots of things to discuss in this respect. But you take the rule of law, and it is a very interesting point, because seen from outside, we have all these problems of law in books, law in action, this discrepancy and so on. At the same time, we have sometimes a very bright picture of the Supreme Court in this country that, for instance, have been trying, bringing out sentences on the right to life, for instance, operationalizing it into terms that the state has to provide at least health and food. Particularly these two have been considered to be judicable. That is to say, they are not just normative principles, they have to be implemented in practice by the people. That is to say, by the government.
Yeah.
Then probably the government, tries to evade this. There is a tension here between the judiciary and the legislative or the executive. Do you see that? Or?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I agree with you. That is how it is. But the fact is, the state, despite being democratic and having legislatures and bureaucracy and the paraphernalia or all the trappings that the state has, cannot itself create or does not create the parliamentarians, the legislators, bureaucrats, see and change that situation. For example, right to life. It's there in the book, always there. But how it became such lively consideration? That's because of social movements. It is one decade of continuous social movement in the South which has been documented, which repeatedly went to the courts and compelled courts to decide and formulate right to life, extending to right to dignified life, right to life extended to right to food. I mean, so what is life? That meaning system and that interpretation was forced on the courts first place by civil society movements, systematically taking this issue. Then it goes to the legislature. Then somebody comes up with right to food and owning as if they. I think our legislations ipso facto for in their own internal way do not think of a single good thing, if you ask me. That has to go. Right to information, right to universal education,
Forest rights.
forest rights. How these have become now important. I mean, behind that there are 2-3 decades of civil society movements banging their doors not opening. It's that kind of thing. Then you get them opened through the courts. Out of 10 cases, 1 case is picked up by the court, and that it travels again back to the top, and then it becomes right to life in a very different way. And this is only 20 years old jurisprudence,
Yeah.
where such interpretation has come to right to life.
So that's,
Otherwise, it was yes, right
No,
to
it's-
life
it's-
means you cannot kill.
yeah,
And
that's
it
what-
was as simple as that.
it's very
The
important.
positive meaning
Yeah.
has come to this political discourse.
Yeah, yeah. No, it is very interesting what you say because it proves very well. It's a wonderful illustration. What I've been calling in my work the counter-hegemonic use of law.
Yeah.
The counter-hegemonic use of law is only possible on the basis of political mobilization. So
Yeah,
there were the grassroots movements that were pushing these institutions into action. And the problem that we have.
And nobody gives credit to these people.
Oh yeah.
I mean, they have still their life and going to establishing right to life, the forest thing and
That's right.
everything.
And I think that a key point here is your concept, which I think you have forcefully put forward, or participatory development.
Yeah.
And we have a very distinguished economist in the world, Amartya Sen, that is putting forward all kinds of ideas about human capabilities and new forms of human development, which for me, quite frankly, sound a little bit too liberal and too Western-centric to be completely adequate, I think, to a diversified world. But the idea of development is totally discredited today, even for people that have been, victims now of development. Development now for peasants in this country, in Mozambique, it's part of our project, in South Africa, in Brazil, means basically that peasants are in their ancestral lands and all of a sudden they become a mining company or a timber company and they destroy your community and you are forced into displacement. So millions of people throughout the world are being displaced by Brazilian companies, by North American companies, by Indian companies for these mega projects. Everything in the name of development. And even some international law provisions like the Convention 169 of the ILO that forces the states to consult the indigenous people, the Adivasi in case, whether these projects should take place. They are really, violating all those conventions. They don't care everywhere. So development is a bad word for people as it is now.
Yeah.
And many people are claiming now alternatives to development. The idea that is not alternative development, it's alternatives to development. The constitution of Bolivia and Ecuador speak even of Quechua words and Aymara words like suma casa in Quechua or suma camana in Aymara to say the project of the bettering their lives, a good life, but it's not development because development in fact sounds as a form of aggression today, because neoliberalism is this plundering of natural resources, as it is now. It will last for 10 years or whatever. It's really very much like the colonial period.
It's all extracting and exploiting,
That's right.
and which shows in money at some stage. That is, but is that development? I mean, that's a real problem. I mean, how can you
What
Look,
is
I'm
development?
prepared to believe that this could be development.
Mhm.
I'm prepared to give 20 years
Mhm.
to judge after 20 years that these 3, 4 projects, so many people displaced, this happened. After 20 years, I'd like to be convinced actually the fruits of that development, who enjoys those fruits?
Right.
I don't say that those who have been displaced don't enjoy, but in a very low level way, little bit. I mean, proportionally, I think 80% of surplus or the fruit or the you get out of development lands in a different context within state, its expenditures, which are not for people. It's a different kind of.
That's right.
Then, in country like India, defense is another problem. I think, you know, our defense budget, how much it goes into this sort of thing and the price of the. So there are very complex issues involved. But the fact is that development does not look like development if you see that 80%, only 20% may percolate to people who have been harmed by development and temporarily ousted, dejected. Others a different way, but in a massive way, it goes to the so many examples are there.
Yeah, it is true, and I think that now very often they don't, even the neoliberalism is not talking about development so much. They talk just about economic growth. So
Yeah.
it comes to the bare bone of the idea of accumulation, of capitalist accumulation. So, for instance, if India is not growing at X percent, then you have a risk. So economic growth is everything. If economic growth is everything, we may devastate populations, destroy the streams and contaminate. So the ecological questions also, not just the displacement.
I think it's a question of balancing, but come to think of it,
Yeah.
this is impromptu. Having seen results of so much development, quote unquote, I would say growth is better than development
Why?
because at least it invites different types of participation in making growth possible. Technology, creation of technology, other kind of things that people. And secondly, it has got to, the money goes down back directly to the people instead of mediated through development, through which 80% is grabbed and used up through corruption.
But we are talking about an hypothesis,
and
not about reality.
No. It
Economic
is
growth is not leading to that at current time, because the countries that grow,
Look, in
most
India,
of it, like
in
Nigeria,
India, the poverty figures have improved with growth,
yeah,
which did not improve with development.
that's right.
So I think at least I have now an open mind to this because the development was all bureaucratic means of growth. I mean, it was not development in response to what people really need and all that. It added to the tertiary expenditures of the state. And so much waste, so much, so the so-called trickle down
That's right.
did not happen. Whereas growth may go directly, I suppose, one way or the other.
I dispute,
I don't want to
I
compare growth
dispute
versus
that
development,
because you know,
but
the countries,
development ultimately turned out to be a partnership between big voluntary organizations and bureaucracy,
yeah, precisely.
and didn't reach much.
But
in
at
terms of-
the bottom of development
Yeah.
is always economic growth. And today, I think they are bluntly saying this. I mean, development is economic growth. And economic growth, they are not interested in trickle down because, in fact, the countries that grow most now, countries like Angola, like Mozambique, like Nigeria, for instance, are countries that are growing. China, I don't know. China is a very special project, and it will take some time until
Yeah,
we
there
know
is a-
what is going on in there. We see that there is already concentration of wealth, as in any capitalist society. I think it is a capitalist society. But in these other states are most extractive states. You know, a couple of people accumulate out of the economic, all the benefits of economic growth, and nothing trickles down. I mean, 70% of the population in Angola is below poverty line.
Growth
and
is not supposed to trickle down. Growth is supposed to expand. I mean, trickle down is a bureaucratic theory that we accumulate and then we give you back, and it will trickle down. I mean, suppose it is so. But and that so many decades of development. I mean, in India, the bottom 20%, nothing has reached to them, despite NGOs, because it gets eaten up. Whereas growth creates supply side demands. The people you have to join. If you have skill, you can find a job. I think the 10 years experience here of growth is better than earlier 20 years of development.
because they create employment for people and so on.
Yeah. Tourism, this, that, whatever. But 20% are in miserable state in India after development of so many years. And I mean, I was part of it in disseminating it, talking about development, but it turned out to be a growth of bureaucratic state. So much money got eaten up in name of development. So many wrong NGOs came. I think, boy, at some stage we have to, I mean, I talk it in a very open-ended way.
Yeah,
I won't say that I've made up my mind, but I've seen these 2 decades if I have to compare, for example.
So you think this neoliberal turn that Mohamed Sinj took place, 10 years ago, have been beneficial in a sense?
I think
Last 10
these
years.
high growth years, let me put it like that, whatever they are now, it is reaching again 5%, less than 5%. But this 10 years of average 8% growth has made richer, tremendously rich, but has also invited, drawn participation of the poor in creating wealth generally and in making their own lives.
But the gap between rich and
Has
poor
increased.
increased.
Yeah, increased. But the bottom level of poor has also increased. So this is I mean, I compare with the development years
Yeah.
of the 70s, 80s, even 90s. So I am not going into theory or ideology of it.
Right.
But the question is, poverty statistics have done better in India in last 10, 15 years.
So this role of the NGOs that you were mentioning, I mean, on one side you have to Horizon, they have written a lot on the grassroots movements and how important
So
they were to
movements are
bring-
different.
Yeah, that's right. So you make a distinction, very
Yes,
clear
I
distinction
always
between
make that
NGOs and grass. What is for you, why do you make so strongly this distinction? It's important for people everywhere because this is important
Because NGOs
everywhere.
become mini bureaucracies.
Uh-huh.
One way or other. They are more in implementing bureaucratic projects, which may be international or national, but they are in the network of implementation. You give me this money, I will have 2 wells put up here. You give this money, I will do that sort of thing. So it's a intermediate function of NGOs that, and taking it to the people. But it is like another reproduction of bureaucracy, in which if through bureaucracy, if 10% reaches people, with the mediation of NGOs, 15%, 20% reaches to people, but it is still there. So that is maybe it was low rate of growth plus development. And at the end of there's a lot of rest. If you have 10% growth, say for 20 years, then development will look quite different.
But development for you is,
So
is in
I am
fact
not against
the
growth.
well-being of people.
Huh?
The development as improving the well-being of people. But what kind of well-being? Is just
No,
to
I'm
buy
talking of
laptops?
actual, I'm not talking conceptually.
Yeah.
Well-being is a different thing, but it is this health project, and you take a certain health project. So the bureaucratic project,
Yep.
then it's not that for this area, according to its local needs, its topography, its water availability, this is the kind of development should be here. There is no scope for this decentralized
size fits all.
conception. Huh?
One size fits all.
Yeah,
What was
so,
the
so
idea?
so you have a budget of putting 2,000 hand pumps. So you do it through NGO bureaucracy. They don't define goals of development. If the local community defines its own goals of development, then it becomes different thing. So there are goals and processes. So goals are not determined by, that's possible only in truly decentralized thing, that we want this development, not your development.
So that's why your emphasis on participation. That is, to
That is
say-
their participation.
Yeah, that's right. So it's very important that people have a say on what they want. And even in Latin America, some indigenous people, where in some countries are very large populations, they even say against development, self-determination.
Yeah.
They say we decide what we want, and there is a very you know,
that's what I mean.
yeah,
basically.
that's precisely this idea of self-determination that goes together with other concepts that are becoming very important. For instance, a Via Campesina, which is a federation of the different unions of peasants around the world, India and many other countries, some more than 100 countries, has put forward the concept of food sovereignty. That is to say, people should, as much as possible, produce their own agricultural products, and they should not depend on transgenic seeds, on these multinational corporations that are trying to take over the agriculture, the peasant agriculture. And this is a major issue in many countries, and I think
So
that
again
probably,
we come back to the structure of polity,
yeah,
in the sense that if people can decide what are their needs and what are their goals, and this is the kind of development we want. To be very crudely put, we don't want school. We want a doctor visiting us.
yeah, that's right.
Now it's scandalous. Why can't you have school? I would like to persuade them to have school, but I will have to begin with that. That what is it that they need today?
Yeah.
Maybe there are scabies, there are these, there are so many things. So if they do not have health, the children even cannot go to school.
Yeah.
So let them decide. I don't think so far, actually in development practice, the needs and goals are not defined by the people for whom development is meant. That is what my
Of course,
objection
yeah.
is.
And I fully agree with you. And this brings us to something that we were discussing before on participatory democracy.
Yeah.
Because I think that coming back to UP and what they are trying to do in Delhi, which is having these wards with participatory democracy and people will decide, in fact, they are doing something that from a sociological perspective, one would say, well, this is not the ideal population to start a project because in Delhi we have these middle classes and middle classes are used to trust the state. So they don't have to participate. The state delivers in one way or the other. How are they going to, convince the middle classes that participation is a good thing in Delhi? Don't you see that as a problem?
See, today it is just crude idea of participation. People should at least be visible, should appear to be counted and to be involved in decision making of whatever kind it is. See, these are beginnings in that sense.
Yeah. But there are some revolutionary things. For instance, this idea that even the homeless can participate. I mean, it's quite, a move, a
So as of
democratic
today,
move.
it seems there is a lot of symbolic meaning
Yeah, that's right.
than real
Yeah,
things, because in 1 month what real we don't know.
yeah,
But there are symbolic projections which sees that there are people
yeah, that's right.
who ought to.
I think they are doing very well in symbolic politics. As,
Yeah, so far.
yeah, an old colleague of mine, much older than me in medicine, Edelman, Murray Edelman, that wrote a book on symbolic politics, precisely these ideas
yeah.
that sometimes they have material consequences. That's
Ideas
right.
of
That's right.
kind
Yeah,
and
they
things
catch up.
happen.
Yeah.
So this is too early to judge.
Hmm.
But that initiative and that phenomenon
Yeah, that's.
is promising, I suppose, in one way or the other. At least it will shake the established assumptions of how to run democracy, I suppose. I don't know.
Okay, so we have finished this part, and we have just one to go, which are the castes, which is a very easy for Dhirubhai. Dhirubhai, there are two questions I would like to ask you to finish our conversation, which has been a wonderful conversation, very, very rich, and I think that our listeners and viewers will enjoy our conversation throughout the day. The first one is that Gandhi was such an important figure of the 20th century that still today, outside India, I see lots of people, reading his work, his preaching, the things he wrote. He wrote a lot. It was 100-volume collection of the writings of Gandhi. Seems to be still relevant. So say something to the people in the world, even though you worked, a long time ago. In some time, will be almost 1 century of his most or best known work. While in India, sometimes I have a sense that Gandhi is an important figure of the past, but does not mean much in the present. Even when people try to make an association between Anna Hazare, many people say, no, he's not a Gandhi, it is something else. He may claim, but he is not. Is Gandhi, is still relevant for the world, and of course for India, or not?
I personally believe that it's more relevant for the world than when he was alive. Even after that, whatever Gandhiana has grown was not that crucial as it has become today for the world, for two reasons. You see, I think this human civilizational problem in terms of nation states, their behavior, other kind of thing, on the whole is going to be the problem of violence. And how to create, how to sustain a non-violent society or non-violent world of the nation states. This requires, I think, basic theoretical work. Gandhi in India has been defeated, if you like, by modernism and the categories of modernism. And India is still stuck into, I think, the thinking opinion and the elite opinion and the educated urban and all that is still stuck to the hard modernist view in terms of defines secularism, it defines other aspects of life, development, growth, everything. Now Gandhi represents a total paradigm. That's the problem about Gandhi, that one has to, and I think that world is poised, or almost about to be poised, for total transformative paradigm of organizing human affairs because of violence as one. I mean, all this terrorism, Naxalism, other kind of violence, small violences. So violence is going to be a central issue, a human civilizational issue, which has always been. And nobody, and even Gandhi, I thought, didn't believe that you can totally abolish violence. But violence need to be politically addressed also. need to be addressed in the management of things, in organization of society, in conducting economy. I mean, it is going to be of that is what I personally think. The self-destructive mode has got to, that would not do away with violences of different kind, but as a major issue. And for that, one has to go to different aspects of Gandhian paradigm to reconstruct polity, for example. Now, we talked about representation and its challenge and its crisis. Now, Gandhi has developed a concept of trusteeship. Now, and that concept he developed for organizing economy, that you are not the owner, you are a trustee of your factory. So you should take whatever you need for decent living and even better than that. But rest, you are a manager of it, you are not a... Now this idea is in a different way come into the corporate world, if you like, in one way or the other. So, but what if this is extended to politics? To sort of interrogate representation from the point of view of trusteeship. So, political trusteeship of the elected people. Who are the elected people? You are representative, you represent what is very difficult, but if you say that you are trustee in the state of the state on behalf of the people, and this is what, so you cannot steal, there are so many other things, once the Guardian, but the idea of trusteeship, I think, could be brought into political discourse. Need not be confined to Guardian idea of Guardian economy. And in one or the other way, it is entering without acknowledgement, but it's there. And the whole theory of trust has come into political science in last 30 years, 20 years, not more. Huh?
That's right.
From trust to trusteeship. It's not a big thing. It's how to look at people who represent us and our affairs. So their Guardian trusteeship, I think, is, and it is coming to that. I think I hear the soundings, but he has to be freed from rituals, from time bound. For example, the Islamic beliefs in the Quran. I mean, people want to free Quran from the time in which it was born. I mean, the time was one thing. Time has its own coordinates, its own demands. But if you free it from the context and make it widely available, it becomes... So we have Gandhian thought. I think that thought needs to be theorized. And I see that kind of theorization coming more from outside India than from India.
Why is that?
Because of social science problem in Indians, as well as the other kind of thing, and the modernism, and the victims of modernism in thought. See Gandhi as an archaic, something non-vegetarian, vegetarian, khadi, non-khadi. These are passive, and these are time-bound. To most prophets, things are time-bound. I won't say Gandhi is a prophet, but a kind of this. So that needs to be context-free for theory. Ginny Sharp, for example, has done it for violence, theory of non-violence, which was used in Egyptian Spring, that non-violence.
That's right.
And likewise, many other places. So I think he is future, but that would not come. Swadeshi, I mean the new...
The Swadeshi, for instance.
You need theory for ecology. And Gandhi has that in Swadeshi, that what you need, I mean you must have control over your surroundings, and then you expand that to the other stages and all that. You can't go into, but concepts like trusteeship, Swaraj, Swadeshi, and Ahimsa, because Gandhi has transformed the Indian idea and practice of Ahimsa by linking it to the Christian idea of love.
That's right.
See, because for him, Ahimsa is a dry ritual if it is not infused with love. I just not kill you, but I must love you. But see, that is the not killing is not enough. So there are such ideas and things, which so it seems that its thought is now waiting for theorization.
That's right.
It cannot stay at the level of thought.
Well, in a sense, I have to say that when I read in Swaraj, I was really very impacted by that idea of self-determination in non-Western conceptions,
Yeah.
because later on, in Africa, when they became independent, many countries and some leaders like Nkrumah is very well, Frantz Fanon was an intellectual that was very active in Africa at that time, and then other leaders like Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, all of them were really interested in this problem and in fact concerned with the problem that we become independent, but it's not real independence because we are copying all, not only the state forms, but also the models and principles of life and of economic organization of the colonizer. So we are not going to be decolonized. We will continue, and that's why Nkrumah created that neologism that became then a very important word of neocolonialism.
Neocolonialism.
That's right. So, and I think that much before, Gandhi was saying, you wouldn't become independent if we don't claim our traditions, our millennial civilization, and put it to use for the future. So I think that I see a sense of there in which we can, in fact, enrich the experience of the world.
Yeah, only if it taken up for theorization. See, most of say Hind Swaraj is a good idea. I mean, how do you read Hind Swaraj?
Yeah.
If you do not read it broadly theoretically, you will be bound to objects. That Gandhi is against trains,
Right.
aeroplane, this object. So it gets object down. I think what need to be crystallized is the principles and values, which may acquire different embodiment. Maybe not like Gandhi might have on thought. It may have new embodiments.
Yeah.
The basic principle is about non-violence, autonomy,
Absolutely, yeah.
and self-respect and dignity of human
That's right,
being,
yeah.
which has to be maintained in a certain way. And and that only theory can do. Thought cannot.
That's right.
Thought has its own, and that's how most advances in human thinking have taken place. I mean, if you pin down Plato
Yeah.
to its own time and its own subjective things and the stand and the shadows and all that, and if you don't go beyond that, but today the Western thinkers would take 2 sentences of Plato and can write 20 books.
That's right. That's right.
So that is what needs
Yeah.
and would happen to Gandhi is freeing from the present, which is bound.
Yeah.
It's more in rituals, in practices of the time.
Yeah. Okay. Dhirubhai, so we come to our last question, which is a very
Yeah.
easy question for you, for our conversation, and that's the part of our conversation in which I am more ignorant, and I acknowledge that because I've read, but I have not lived the experience that you have experienced and we are experiencing in this country. I'm talking about caste. Because in my way of thinking, in a part of my work, I say, well, there are different ways in which you create a discrimination, and one is the monoculture of classifying people. We classify them as inferior. And I have dealt with women, with slaves, with Afro-descendants, indigenous people, and so on. But I never touched upon the question of caste. And many people sometimes in the world say, look, India is becoming, was emergent power and so on, and they have this caste system in which the base for discrimination is a duality that is very uncommon, which is the duality between purity and pollution. So purity and pollution, how can we imagine that there is a social classification in a society based on purity and pollution, and then deriving in all kinds of rituals and so on? You have written extensively about caste. Before you say what, of course, what we have to say, and it's very important, your analysis on caste as current affairs in India, could you say a word for people that know nothing about castes? What are castes? What?
Look, I think that's a good question. I mean, that question I should ask myself also every time to understand what it is. But whatever little I have followed in practice, observing and doing field work at one level and in thought, it seems to me that Indians, perhaps all South Indians, are, I mean, instinctively, if you like, or as a part of habit, want to congregate, want to be and belong to community. And wherever they go, they find out some fragments to hang on to make a community or some kind of a kinship, secondary community, secondary kinship grouping. And they are comfortable only when they belong to a primary group. It may be true of all, but I cannot claim that. But so primary grouping gives security, emotional and others, not die-hard individuality. I think die-hard individuality is still, South Asians are scared of it. They want emotional bonding of different kind, not just male-female, two individuals kind of thing. And they now recreate in a secondary way, in the workplace, a substitute of kinship and all that. So this is given. So it's a country historically of communities and community formations. We have talked about it in this conversation. And this became around occupations and all that. So castes are basic, has two aspects. One, the community aspect, larger community it could be, which are formed around common practices, religious, economic, political, and that formation of a community takes place. These have all been a horizontal affair, a community here, community there, meeting in the marketplace, meeting in the religious place, doing this. This is, and these, then once they form, even today it happens that that community perpetuates by marrying within that community. Today in India, 80%, I have not done survey, but the sense I get, the 80% children of doctors are married among doctors. I don't know in the West, but this is a general preference here. So you form a community. Some sect happens around this, some guru, and a community forms around that. So much so that the marriages also take place among the followers of the same guru. So this is the scene of community. Now today you have secondary communities, different of doctors, of lawyers, of corporate, the marriage alliances and everything. Now this horizontal scene was straight-jacketed at a particular time in history where these communities were structured and turned around into a hierarchy. And that was done by the victors. And Ambedkar has written good theory about it. So Brahmin organized the hierarchy to sustain society and state in their own way, and to see that there is no monopoly, which is total. So you have monopoly of knowledge as Brahmins, I have monopoly of trade and commerce, this, that, and this fourfold hierarchical structure of Brahman, which is an intellectual class of thinkers and norm-setters for the whole society, who are supposed not to accumulate wealth. They will be, ideally, they will be looked after by the rest of the society if you are doing your job. Then you have the Kshatriyas, the second, whose who are the rulers, the government
Yeah.
makers of the government and rule, and basically the kings, Rajanyas. And therefore they should be trained for warfare, for protection, for administration and that sort of. Then the traders and the tillers, the Vaishyas. Then those who are primary producers, Shudras. You make shoes or somebody makes agricultural tool, the artisan communities and others who are supposed to be serving the other three. So this hierarchy, according to me, was political. It established Brahminic rule and Brahminic paradigm of society. So this was hierarchy. And there was the fifth class, which was outside the caste system, for whom nothing was provided. For these four, somebody has said there was a right to work. Some American
Right.
lawyer, well-known lawyer, has written about it, with a title called Right to Work in ancient India. But the fifth were outsiders. Now, Ambedkar has written a good history about it, how they were turned into Dalit and broken people outside the caste order. So this fivefold hierarchy, four hierarchy and those outside hierarchy
The untouchables.
are the untouchables. Outside hierarchy, like almost like excommunicated, no? Once you are put outside, it's equivalent to the Christian idea of
That's
pushing
right.
out.
Yeah, that's
What is it called? Excommunication.
excommunication.
Excommunication. I mean, that is the phenomenon. Then multiple things happen in the sense that those
The tribal people.
Huh?
What happened to the tribal people? Were
the
outside.
tribal are not like that. Tribal is a very different.
It's
there is
different
a
from this.
differentiate. They were also rulers of their own land who were defeated
Right.
by Kshatriyas, and or they made to be Kshatriya. They were absorbed also. So many tribals also became Kshatriya.
That's it.
See, we have not talked about this. We have so these were not straitjacket. It was a straitjacket, but the categories were porous. You can become a Kshatriya by establishing a rule over 5 villages. And some Brahman would sacralize also your position. And you become Kshatriya. Yesterday you were tribal. And they are still there. I am not talking abstract. So that became a hypergamy in which blue-blooded Kshatriyas will take women from the quote-unquote lower Kshatriyas. The tribal who was yesterday tribal became a king today. And there are such states in Gujarat at least that I know of. So that happens. So these were also open categories, except the Brahmin. Brahmin was also. If you migrate, you can claim different kind of caste with different kind of thing. So this was not a completely cut and dry system. These were all porous, but still hierarchical. Now, if you cast today, I think the hierarchical aspect has more or less collapsed. There is an implosion in the hierarchy. It's all helter-skelter, it is here, there. So hierarchy has collapsed, but communities survive. And more communities are created around different things, around a sect, around a guru, around something else, around a community, in urban area and all that. So there is a hierarchical aspect and there is a community aspect of caste. Hierarchical caste aspect has almost totally collapsed except for Dalits in some parts, more in rural than in urban and that sort of thing. So if you look at it as a process, I think the hierarchical structure has imploded into horizontal. Where
Castes will disappear? You think castes will
hierarchy,
disappear?
hierarchy, yes, certainly. Hierarchy has almost disappeared.
Really?
That's how I read it. But not communities, not their identities. And small kinship groups are very closely, tightly So community of 5,000 people and communities of 50,000 and all that. They are politically reorganized again into governmental categories of OBC, means other backward classes, SC and that thing. So that is the administrative categorization, which is very broad, in which so many communities are there. And that through that, the idea of hierarchy still survives. But it is now put on its head, that hierarchy. So there are many claimants who may be upper caste but claim to be Dalit so that they can get government benefit.
But if
That also happens because that's individual.
But that's a caricature, I think.
Huh?
It is more a caricature. I think that
Not
no
caricature,
Brahmin
but
is not
it
going to claim to be a Dalit to claim for reservation.
Because he doesn't cease to be Brahmin and he still gets this reservation. That is the, he doesn't cease to be Brahmin, but he gets reservation.
But you know, your argument leads
By-
directly to
by-
the end of reservations, because if there is no hierarchy, why reservations?
No, these are two different issues. Reservations,
Explain.
see, reservation has been castized in discourse, but basically reservation is a secular policy.
Group rights.
Not group rights so much, not even group rights. Group is an identifiable, easy way of identifying individual households which are socially, economically, educationally backward. So reservation is not for castes. Reservation is for backward people. But backward people, 80%, 90% belong to certain castes.
That's it.
So caste becomes a easy indicator
Of
of recognizing backwardness and giving benefits. But that easy indicator, consolidated communities. See, that's the double barrel situation. So that sort of also crystallized the identity of backward and that sort of thing. But basically, and theoretically, and in principle, reservation is those who are deprived, households who are deprived historically and have remained backward and cannot equally compete with others. So it is to create a level playing field for those who do not have a level playing field. So primarily it is backwardness. Backwardness is an unfortunate Indian English word, but those who are left behind in the race of growth, development and modernity, they have to be given a special push so that they can compete better. I mean, this is the rationale of reservation. But since, because of the earlier hierarchical structure, almost 70%, 60% population was outside this competitive world because they could not acquire that kind of education and everything. So they have to be recognized, especially for entry into education system, entry into government job system and all that. So it is, caste is an indicator of backwardness. Now these castes are differentiated. Now the backward caste X was uniformly illiterate
Or poor,
and uniformly poor because of the inherited disadvantages and universally living in slums or this side of India. Now that caste, after reservation of 30, 40 years and other developments that might have taken place, is differentiated from inside.
I see.
So there are rich as in other castes, and there are poor. There are educated, maybe 20%, but uneducated others. So that differentiation is making caste as a bad indicator of backwardness.
With the,
And
time.
that is why you are right, that logic cannot hold perpetually, that because you belong to this caste, you need reservation. Because meanwhile, your caste has transformed. So many people have become richer. So many people have become educated. There are so many graduates in your caste. There are castes like this, which should not be there in the reservation system at all.
Well, I think that your analysis is so subtle and so complex, Dhirubhai, on this relationship between interest and identity.
Yeah.
The need to make for some new categories that integrate caste criteria with class criteria.
That's
because
happening already.
That's right.
I mean, I've done some work on middle class.
The new middle classes
Yeah,
that
yeah.
you talk about,
And they are entering there.
they are entering there. Yeah.
So that's a process. But in that process, identity politics get heightened.
Yeah. So that's very
Because
this
insofar as those upper class Dalit
Yeah.
can keep their lower class brethren
Yeah.
into their own hold,
Yeah.
it's very difficult. But now there are movements of lower class Dalits against upper class Dalits. Just as there are movements for lower class Muslims and lower caste Muslims against the upper class Muslims. Because upper class Muslims want to claim minority reservations
I see.
and the lower class Muslims do not want it and they do not support it.
So that's these terror
So
dynamics.
these are the differentiations
Yeah.
which makes the whole thing very dynamic
Very dynamic.
and fascinating at
Yeah.
one level. But,
Yeah.
but we have not talked about caste among Muslims.
That's right.
But
That's,
that is there.
There are, yeah. In fact, in our project, someone
But the
is,
totalizing
yeah.
leaders do not want to recognize those.
But there are Muslims.
Yeah, there
Dalit
are Muslims and they
especially.
want to assert that we don't want reservations for all Muslims.
And they have a movement, even they have movements.
If we have that, we won't get anything. It is only the upper class Muslims will
Yeah.
get it.
It's
Competing with
fascinating.
upper class Hindus.
It's fascinating, Dhirubhai. I mean, we have finished. This is a fabulous conversation. And just in a few paragraphs, there are lots of people throughout the world and that may be listening to us. And our project is an European funded project. And the basis of the project is that the North, the global North, has a lot to learn from the global South. After our conversation, I think that I'm more than convinced than I was before, probably, even though I know your work and we have been friends for such a long time now, that in fact there is a lot to be learned from the experiences of the global South, in this case from
But
India.
at the end, I would also like to say, Boa, that global South has also have to learn a lot, not necessarily from global North, but I think we have to discard the old categories about intercultural learning, which are East and West, North and South. I think this is under globalization. I think a different kind of mutual learning has to take place because global South is devastated in terms of intellectual life,
Yeah.
in terms of finding their own solutions. So maybe you can learn from global South, but I would like to know that what global South can learn from others, and there
Well,
is great
yeah,
need to learn,
That's right.
and more to learn. There is great need to unlearn the slavish concepts
Yeah.
with which we are working in other kind of things. So I would say that these are old, tired categories of Eastern for intercultural learning,
Yeah.
not other things.
No, I
Our
agree.
system is different, but East, West, North, South, I think whether we like it or not, we are pushed into a larger global context in which we have to find new pedagogic ways of learning from each other.
Precisely. I mean, I usually say that there are epistemologies of the South, as I call them, only because there are epistemologies of the North. That is to
Yeah.
say, this epistemological impulse of learning from the South is organized or thought in such a way that it won't be needed in the near future. Because there is South, because there is North. And the North has been also an unequal relationship, and we can say that after all, the global south has always learned from the north because it was the colonial imposition. What we are calling for is for new ways of learning. We were
exactly.
saying, I mean,
That is not a
that's,
pedagogic.
that's right. More horizontal forms of learning.
Yeah, more horizontal.
That's right. And there the global north will appear in a different.
Because both are victims of a certain paradigm at
Absolutely.
one level.
Yeah.
So, so I think the learning, let us keep it up.
Absolutely.
A two-way process.
No, it's a two-way process, and because of this, precisely because how we start our conversation. Remember that the first topic that we addressed was the question of relation between power and knowledge.
Yeah.
What we are saying that once, and this comes very much as a good conclusion of our conversation, is that once we separate the two, and in a sense that we try to have knowledge,
Then learning becomes
then
natural.
learning becomes possible. What has been wrong with the north and the south, east and west, is the power relations.
Very
and,
well put.
and I think it's
Absolutely.
well, that's the way we have to go. Thank you, dear
Splendid,
Bhai.
splendid.
Give me a hug. That's wonderful. That's